Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm Mocotaugan making project. Today we're going to do our final bends and our final heat treat on these blades. Okay. So this is one that's in its final shape, and this is one that has had all of the cold work done on it. Okay. Now you have to be very careful when you're doing everything here. We have a fairly thin edge at this point. And it's very easy to take that edge off if you get it over warm. Okay, if you do that, you're going to say, gosh golly gee whizzikers, I wish I had not done that. Okay. Also, you see snow. You don't want to drop it in the snow or you water quench it and wreck it, which I kind of did to this one a few minutes ago. So this will not be turned into a finished blade. But I still have it here to show you the shape that we're going for. You can see the blade is straight, but has a little bit of an upsweep tip. If I put this on the anvil, you can see there's a slight bend right where the blade meets the tang. And then this little bit of bend that I'm grabbing onto with the tongs is going to serve as the pin to help hold it into the handle. Okay? So this is the form that we're going for. Before we do that, before we go for that form, we're going to normalize this one more time. You want to make sure that it's blade edge up so that the spine heats faster than the blade edge. And you want to watch it like a hawk. It is very difficult to do this and film at the same time because you really need full attention on that blade. We're going to normalize it once more to see if it warps at all in this. If you remember when we forged it in the first place, I normalize it twice after it stops warping. The reason a thin blade will warp when you heat it up is because when it goes from back and forth between the body center cubic and base center cubic arrangement of the carbon and iron atoms, and at some point here I will do an entire video just on what that means in the heat treating. But the cold and the hot form or arrangements are different in size. It actually expands and contracts. So if there's tension in it and you're forcing this expansion, it will just go with that tension and warp it. So we want to see if that's going to happen. If that happens, we straighten it and do more normalization. And then again, we want to get two in a row where it doesn't. If it doesn't happen, since we know we've already normalized it a lot, we're just going to go and do the bending. So I have this in here, we're getting it warm. The tip was just warm, I moved it off of the flames. Now I'm heating it back towards the transition with the tang. I was trying to talk and work at the same time on that other one, and it popped out of my tongs and went right in the snowbank. Snow water quench from red hot, not good for carbon steel. So we're refilming this, but I will admit my mistake to you folks. Okay. That stayed very nice. So I'm going to let that cool and make sure it still stays. This one I normalized a few minutes ago, and it stayed nice and straight, so I'm going to go and put the curves on this one. First, I'll go for that curve in the tip. Very gentle, very slow on this heating. If you overheat the edge, you'll see a little bit of crazing in it. That means it's decarburizing. It doesn't mean that the blade is ruined, but it does mean that you're going to have to grind back that edge a little bit more when you do your final sharpening. Okay, we're good to go. Now this bend is going to be against the bevel. Bevel down. It's not a real dramatic bend. Just a little bit. Okay. Now the next bend will be in the same direction right here. Trying to get the coals just so that I can work with it, get it hot enough, and protect it at the same time. Don't want to do this when you have too much flame coming up out of the fire. If you have real green smoky coal, do something else for a while until it's conditioned well. Then come back and do this stuff. Another light bend. Okay, can you see how it's just kind of tipped off the anvil just a little bit? All we want. Now the last bend is this tang. And I want about, palm width worth of tang. But just shy of that palm width, it'll go into the handle. So I'm just going to put it on here, put the edge of the blade on this, and then just bend it right down over there. Make sure everything's straight. Again, really small, really fine pieces that we're working with. You can overheat really, really quickly. Now overheating, the tang is not going to be hardened. So if you get a little spark or two off the very end of the tip of your tanger, most of that's going to get cut off anyway. I'm only going to leave about 3/8 inch to stick into the handle. And the tang's going to be about an inch, inch and a half long, you'll see hanging down over here. So most of that's going to get cut off. So that's not as big a deal as if you get crazing on the blade itself. But still, we don't want to needlessly cause ourselves problems. Okay. Good. Now that curved in on a little bit in on me. You probably are not going to pick it up. Paint that once more, straighten it out. We're going to be into the quench very, very soon, and then we don't want to be heating this anymore. So this is your chance to get it right. Don't rush. On the side. That right there is where I drop them more often than not if I'm going to. That's where I dropped the one that I dropped into the snow. It bounced on me. Okay. That's all straight and pretty. The blade's straight and pretty. The edge looks good and intact, except for one little spot there that I'm going to lose maybe a 1/16 of an inch. That's okay. We'll still have a nice blade out of it. Now we're going to go for the heat treat. Now to do this, I need to get the whole thing in even temperature, and I can't have blast on to do it. You're going to take too much. I'm going to need to bury too much of it, and I have to blast on. I'm going to burn it. So I'm just going to keep it at temperature, keep the coals at the surface at the temperature I want. Pulse the air a little bit. Cool off my tongs. Pulse the air a little bit just to keep it at temperature, but not get it crazy hot, or you will ruin it. And you can control where the heat is by where you position the little clumps of coke that are on top there. More coke on top of your material, it will heat up faster in that region than where it's uncovered. And I have the tip up, so the tip heats up the slowest. So the back is heating up first, and then that temperature, I'm just watching it crawl out to the tip. Okay? And we're about there. And then that little coffee can behind me is a can of oil. What oil works? Basically all of them. Don't overthink your oil. You could do this in vegetable oil. You can do this in a motor oil or hydraulic fluid. You can do this in all sorts of things. Now the tip didn't quite get hot enough, so I'm just going to hold it down for a second. There we go. Move it straight up and down, not side to side. Make sure it's in good contact. Make sure it's all the way cool before you take it out of the oil. Okay. Now these fumes, do not breathe these fumes. Those fumes contain little droplets of vaporized oil particles. Your lungs cannot clean themselves of vaporized oil particles. This is another one of those things where people will get into arguments over what's the most dangerous oil to use for your lungs. The correct answer is all of them. They are all dangerous to use for their lungs. But notice I'm in a cross breeze and none of this fume is coming anywhere near my face. Okay. And now we examine it. Absolutely dead straight. Well, except for the obvious where I didn't want it to be straight. No cracks. No obvious grazing. My edge dented a little bit, which I'm going to have to polish out. But that is a nice blade. Okay? So now the next step with this is to get rid of that. We'll clean it. I'll take it in. I will let it cool. This would still burn me if I touched it. I will clean it with dish soap. I will soak it again in the vinegar solution to take all the scale off. So it's nice, easy to polish. I will get the scale off and cut this to. I'll cut that little tank protrusion to about in half and straighten it a little bit. And then we will resume starting to collect materials for the handling and building the handle. But we now have a blade. Okay, in the first part of this video you saw the forging, or the final forging to the final shape. We started with a blank like this and forged it into this final blade, which is bent and curved in every possible direction, right? You can really see it here that the handle is canted up. We have this little hook on the tang, and this has been, off camera, I just cut that off to 3/8 inch with a simple hacksaw, because the tang was not hardened, right? So this is going to mount in the handle like that, and that little projection on the tang is going to act as a pin to help hold it in place, right? So we have the little curve for the purpose of carving and gouging out concavities when we're using this as our one-handed draw knife, you can start to see how it fits in the hand and why it's such a nice ergonomic tool. Right? My hand is in a relaxed position as pulling. Now, when it came out of the quench, this was absolutely glass hard. Remember, there's a hard form and a soft form of steel, and it has to do with the arrangement of the carbon and the iron atoms. In one configuration, the carbide globs are smaller and more closely packed together. In the high temperature arrangement, it goes to a different orientation, and I'll do an entire video on the details of this. I'm just trying to be quick here for today. Different orientation, but it expands a little bit when it goes into that orientation. Then when we quench it, we're freezing it out, and that hard orientation doesn't have time to switch back to the soft. But when you do that, it's glass hard, and if you were to take this and give it a good smart whack, you could destroy it. You could easily break any blade if you bend it too much in that hard condition. And especially something thin like this, right? This is not this is not a blade that is intended to ever survive the forged in fire ice chop. No, this is a delicate carving tool that is intended to be thin, sharp, and taken care of, right? So we need to soften it a little bit. And how you soften it is you allow it to heat up in a very controlled fashion. This is called tempering. You're allowing it to heat up in a very controlled fashion to a moderate heat, not an incandescent heat. Okay? And at that moderate heat, it will allow some of those carbide aggregates to jiggle back down into their soft condition. And the higher the temperature you raise it to, the more, or the larger a percentage of those can jiggle back down into the soft configuration. That's the simplest, most straightforward way to explain what we're doing. Okay? So these are still dead soft. Those have not had the cold work done on them. These were hardened and tempered. Now, I doubt that the camera is going to pick it up well, but you might see there's a little bit of a bluish cast. Or a little, can it pick that up? Tang towards you or tip towards you? These words. Tip towards you? Okay, can you see it a little bit? Okay. Those are the tempering colors. This one you might be able to see, well, in natural sunlight, up close, like this close to my face, I can see a yellowish cast to this one. And a very pale blue to that one, just off of yellow. Now, as you start to heat it below incandescent, but warm enough to burn you for sure, right? You will start to go through a series of colors. First you see yellow, very pale straw, then that straw will darken to a deep straw, then it will transition to a purple, and then a light blue, a dark blue, and fade off to gray. Okay? If it fades off to gray, you have allowed virtually all of those carbide arrangements to revert to the soft condition, and you no longer have a hardened blade. Okay? And as you go up through those colors, you're going softer and softer and softer and softer. Now, a graving tool or a scribe, this is a little triangle scribe that I want to stay very, very hard. So I only heated this one to 440 and then held it there for a half hour in a kitchen oven. You can use a kitchen oven as a tempering oven. You don't need to go outside of the range of kitchen oven temperatures to do this. Okay. So I heated this one and held it at 440 for an hour. And that's kind of in the middle of the hard scribe range. Okay, so this retained most of its hardness. These I did at 540, which is the range that you want to do for a blade that's going to take some abuse, but not a chopping tool. Okay. A chopping tool like an axe, you want to do more at a strong dark blue, and that's more like 560 range. Once you get up towards about 600, you no longer have an edge tool. So a splitting wedge would be good to do at 600. If you wanted just a tiny bit of hardness, but really you don't care about holding an edge, 600 would be a good temperature. Springs are done at that dark blue 550, 560 range. Okay? Draw knives are done between 5 and 520, 540. Right? I did these at 540 because I want them to be just barely soft enough that I can sharpen it with a file in the field if I need to. Okay? So it's a little bit softer than most knives. There's a trade-off between hardness and softness. As you go in the soft direction, it's tougher, it's springier. Like I said, spring steel is done at like a rich dark blue. But it is not as abrasion resistant, so you're going to have to sharpen it more often. Most commercial knives are done right at the transition between straw and purple. Okay? And, you know, right around the 500, the 480, 490, 500 range, depending on the steel you're working with. And they are then harder, a little more likely to chip if you hit something with it. They are too hard to sharpen with a file, but they will hold an edge forever and a day. Okay? So an axe is very easy to sharpen with a file, and it will hold an edge for quite a while that's sharp enough to perform its intended purpose. But at that temperature, it's not really going to make a good shaving tool. So this is a compromise between typical knife hardness and typical axe hardness. It's halfway in between. Right? And when you're doing this sort of work, there's not necessarily just a recipe. There's what is your intended purpose, what are your intended design criteria, and what compromise do you want to strike between hard edge retention and soft, easy to sharpen, shock resistant. Okay? So mine are in the draw knife range, where they will hold a very good edge, they'll hold it for a long time, but not quite as long as a Sloyd knife. Yet I can still sharpen them with a file. So it's a compromise temperature, right? Is it, I'm sure somebody will want to say, you're doing it wrong. Well, no, I'm not. I chose my compromise. You are welcome to choose a different compromise for a different set of design criteria. But you do have to recognize that there's no one perfect, correct way to do this. There is only a sliding scale of compromise positions. Okay? Pick which one you like. So these I went for medium hard. This I went for extremely hard. This scribe is going to be mounted to about there. Only this little bit sticks out, and it's 3/8 inch thick round stock. It's not going to break. And I'm not going to have to sharpen it very frequently. So I'm fine to take a little bit longer for infrequent sharpenings. So I went toward the hard end of the spectrum on the compromise for this. Is that correct? No. Is it incorrect? No. It's my design choice. Okay? Now, if you want to get into doing things like this, you're going to need reference material and tables which give you perspective on how these colors are running and what temperatures they run at and what characteristics those different temperatures present. Can they see this, hon? Okay. Awesome. So I have two books that I'm going to recommend to you. Again, none of these videos are sponsored. These are my own opinions. Sadly, both of these books are out of print and a little difficult to find, so you're going to need to get a little creative with your use of used booksellers online. The first is Tool Making for Woodworkers by Larsen. Can you see the title, Well Beloved? Awesome. Okay. And right inside the cover, that has a great table. I can't show you for copyright. I can't show you a lot of pages in the book, but I can certainly plug the cover. And this one also has great tables in it. The Making of Tools by Alexander G. How do you pronounce that? Weygers. Weygers. Okay? By Alexander G. Weygers. The Making of Tools. So these are two good reference materials. Now to actually execute this tempering step, three ways. The modern way, and inarguably the best way if you want to spend a lot of money to get the equipment, is a commercial heat treating oven that is thermostatically controlled. You can look up a table of hardness values for a known, not recycled steel, and you can program it to give you exactly a known hardness. If you are going to do this commercially, that is what you should do. Right? There is no better way to do it. Second way, and second best, is to just use your kitchen oven and time it with a timer. In terms of an end user, there's not going to be a whole lot of noticeable difference. But the commercial heat treating oven is more controllable and more accurate than a kitchen oven. Okay? But in terms of me using this scribe and then loaning it to somebody and them using it, they're not going to be able to tell whether I did it in a kitchen oven or a commercial heat treating oven, right? So it's still a good way. It's still a good way. The third, and this is the real old school way, would be to take a tool like this, heat the tang about the last inch of it, where my fingers are, to glowing red hot. And then hold it and watch visually as those temperatures run their way up. And then when straw gets to the tip, requench it. Okay? That's the old school way to do this. I strongly dislike it because what you end up with is, instead of a consistent hardness, you end up with a hardness gradient. So when you first use the tool, it's going to be a little too hard. And then as you sharpen it, you'll get into its sweet spot. And then as you sharpen it more, it'll be too soft. And you have to dismantle your tool and retemper it. Reharden and retemper it. Okay? I'm not a fan of doing it that way, but it will work. It was done that way for eons. And the majority of your real old antiques were tempered that way. Right? And this is part of why a lot of antique chisels are very swingy, I'll say, in terms of their hardness and their edge retention. Because they were tempered in this fashion, so the sweet spot is only about a 1/4 inch, right? And above that is too hard, below that is too soft. So if you're using an antique chisel and it won't hold its edge, it's probably because you sharpened it back behind the sweet spot for hardness. And the only way to recover that is to requench, retemper. Okay? Not a fan. The second old school way is to get some sacrifice piece, put it in the fire, get it red hot, put it on a rack, and then set this on top. And again, watch the temperatures rise. That will give you a more... You can do the same with a torch, by the way, in modern terms. That will give you a consistent hardness throughout the entire length, but it won't give you a consistent hardness across the entire width. Because wherever portion it is in contact with the material, with the hot material or the torch, will get a little softer. Whatever's farthest away from that will remain a little harder. Now, if you're doing something that's an asymmetric tool, that's okay. If you're doing that on a chisel, right, you just put it with the bevel down. And you're going to excessively soften the part that will never be sharp. Totally fine. But when you're doing a symmetrical tool like this scriber or a knife, it's not really practical. And on something with as many curves as this guy, it's very difficult. So then you end up having to do this over with a torch or over the flame of your forge. And it's just, you're going to end up with hard spots and soft spots. So, can be done. I have done it. I have done it successfully. You can also do it successfully. But I very much recommend using an actual, real oven of some sort. We live in the 21st century. You have ovens. Use your oven. Okay? And if it's too big to fit in your oven, what are you doing? Right? It's like you're too big for a carving tool, and I'm not worried about that. So, we're going to leave this here. This concludes the work except for final grinding and sharpening. You do want to look at these once you get it all nice and polished and look for cracks and inclusions. It's a final check. Again, these are recycled steel. Some will fail at no fault of yours. Right? You can do everything perfectly and still have a blade fail. Some will. A couple of these have some small inclusions where probably a little bit of rust popped out, or there was a little bit, it won't pick up in the camera, but there's one right here in this blade that I'm pointing to. Okay. I can probably file through that. It's not a crack, it's an inclusion. So a little piece of mill scale got hammered in, or a little piece of rust or a pebble that got stuck into the rust, or something was there that then popped out when it quenched. So you'll see those after the quench that you don't see before it. Two of these have some small inclusions. This one has one right here where it's really thick. I know for sure I can file that one out. I think I can file this one out. It's getting a little thin right in that spot where it is. So I'm not 100% sure, but an inclusion will have rounded edges, a crack will have sharp edges, and that's the difference. Now, if you don't file all the way through and get underneath that inclusion, it will eventually become a crack and break your blade. But if it's a little surface spall and it's got rounded edges, you can just file through it and you'll probably be fine, the majority of the time anyway. Okay? So you want to do those last things. The next video in this series will be handling. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you liked the video, and give us some comments on